Hello, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening. Welcome again to another session of the school. And today we're going to be having our Columbia University sessions with Chief Raja Devashish Roy. But before we start, we're going to welcome Pema to give us the opening invocation before we can welcome our guest. So Pema, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Winnie. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to our session today. And from my Indigenous language, Tashitele to everyone. So today I'm going to recite some of our traditional prayers that we usually pray before we start anything auspicious. So I'd like everyone to close their eyes and do the namaste. So I'd like to start now. Dimbalame sange rimburche, Kyubalame tamje rimburche, Dimbalame kendin rimburche, Gamne kunzok shumla chubabul. Dimbalame sange rimburche, Kyubalame tamje rimburche, Dimbalame kendin rimburche, Gamne kunzok shumla chubabul. Tusum sange guru rimburche, Tusum sange guru rimburche, Tusum sange guru rimburche. Tusum sange guru rimburche. Thank you, everyone. So what these prayers means is that we'd like to remember our ancestors. We would like to remember our natural resources. We'd like to remember all our mothers and grandmothers. We'd like to remember our spirits. We'd like to remember our spirit animals as well. And we'd like to ask for your permission to start this auspicious action. And we'd like to request you to bless us with your blessings and give us all your blessings to make the event successful. And thank you for being with us in all our lifetime, and we hope to meet you soon. So this is what this prayer means, and I hope with this prayer we are going to continue our today's session very successfully. And I'd like to welcome the speaker of our today's sessions as well, and I'd like to hand over to Winnie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pema. Thank you for sharing your prayer with us and for starting this session for us. And so just before I invite our guest today, I'm going to read out his bio so that we know a little bit about him before he comes to speak to us. So Raja Devashish Roy is the hereditary Chakma Raja and chief of the Chakma Circle in the Chittagong Hill Tracts region of Bangladesh since 1977. He oversees the work of 179 territorial chiefs and nearly 2,000 village chiefs. Karbaris, including nearly 400 women in his circle territory comprising of 5,800 square kilometers. He studied in Bangladesh and later in the UK and Australia. He's a barrister affiliated with the Honourable Society of Lincoln in London and is enrolled as an advocate at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh since the late 80s. He has been a leading actor in supporting peace processes in conflict-affected areas, including the Chittagong Hill Tracts. He facilitated the final negotiations between the government of Bangladesh and the Indigenous People's Party, the JSS, at the request of the parties, leading to the signing of the Chittagong Hill Tract Accord of 1997. He has played a leadership role in the process of adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, including as the co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus in 2006 to 2007. In 2008 to 2009, he served as the Minister of State in the interim non-party caretaker government of Bangladesh and led several national delegations to international conferences, including on climate change. He was an Indigenous nominated member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues for 2 terms between 2011 and 2016. He has been involved in advocacy, research, development, environmental, and human rights work for more than 20 years and has several publications, including Rutledge Taylor, and Francis Cambridge University Press, IFAD, ILO, and a number of university journals. He has advised members of parliament on constitutional reforms in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar. He has also been closely involved in the process related to reforms in the indigenous people's policies of the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the Asian Development, the European Commission, and the Danish Government Development Agency, DANIDA. So we're very happy to have you again this year, and we welcome you. Thank you so much for making the time to come and join us in our session today, and to share your knowledge and to share your knowledge and your experiences with us during this session. So welcome, Chief Devashish Roy. The session is now yours. Please let us know if we can assist you or support you in any way, and we're happy to do so. Please unmute yourself, please. You're on mute, Chief.
Thank you very much, Ms. Winnie Koti and Ju. Good evening, good morning, whatever time of the day to everyone. And I can see dear Elsa too. A very good day to you, Elsa. I am in your hands, and I have taken on board as much as possible from Elsa's very, very wise advice and guidance. The first things, the technical matters first. I have a PowerPoint. I have sent a PowerPoint, and I actually made a few changes, mostly minor to it, since I sent it to you. So if I can, I would take the first option of sharing the PowerPoint from my end. And failing that, I've sent a copy to Elsa, who has sent it on to Guatemala. And I hope to you too, Winnie. And then one of you can kindly help me with the PowerPoint. Shall I give a try to sharing the screen first?
Yes, we'll ask the technical team to give you the rights to be able to share, and then you can go ahead. Okay. So you can check the screen. If you can check your screen if you're able to share already.
Yes, it says that Devashish is co-host now.
Okay, I am just trying to get the. I have my slide open, and then I go to screen share.
Yes.
I try to do that. Okay, I say share screen. I get the screen share, but it doesn't show the file I want to share. What do I do? Select a tab to preview. Window. No. I do forget sometimes. Anyway, if that fails, then I'm in your hands if somebody can share the PowerPoint that I sent. Right? And in the meantime, I can try again.
When it should give you the options it should show you the windows that are open on your computer, and then you can select the one that is your PowerPoint.
Maybe I have too many windows open now. I'll close the windows. I'll try again. Okay, I try to. I've opened the PowerPoint. It's open, and as far as I know, that's the only one. But I have many windows on my computer, which I suppose I can close. Those don't matter. Okay, now I try again. It just says, it doesn't give me the option of my PowerPoint. The share of it gives me some things other than what I want to share, and I don't know how to get to the PowerPoint. I have already kept it open on my desktop. It's already open, but when I open share, the tabs, this is Chrome tab or window, Microsoft PowerPoint, Finder. Should I go to Finder? No. Microsoft PowerPoint.
Yeah, try the Microsoft PowerPoint.
Okay, I am clicking, nothing happens. I'm using a Mac, by the way, if that's of any use. Okay, if somebody from the file I sent can be opened there, or I can, of course, speak whilst looking at my PowerPoint without it having to be shown on the screen.
We can share the file that you sent.
Okay.
If that's okay, and then you can add on the things that you did edits on as you. Okay. All right.
That's good. Good enough. Good enough for me.
Right, just a moment.
Oh, yes. Is this what you are showing that I'm seeing on the screen?
Yes.
Yes, Chief.
Great. Thanks very much. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, this is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So going clockwise as the clock, I start with how the practice of self-determination, how it has evolved under international law. I say a little bit on indigenous on indigenous identity. I think quite disconnectedly, but anyway, never mind. I hope you can dot the lines, line the dots, and then the right of self-determination in the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples under it. Then I move on to just a brief mention of the jurisprudence of the treaty monitoring bodies on the right and free, prior, and informed consent. Then to consultation and participation, which actually is a very basic cornerstone of ILO Convention 169. Then I talk about the right and how sometimes state officials tend to look at the exercise of this right, including that of indigenous peoples. Then I just leave you with some examples of how I see the right being exercised in different countries in Asia and some of the challenges. And Elsa asked me if I could also mention a little bit of the issue of enhanced participation in the UN, indigenous people's participation. So actually, I just briefly mentioned that. So I wasn't able to get into the details. So let's see how it happens. And again, taking Elsa's advice, I have no problem with the 3 hours. I think we've already 25 minutes has gone, so we have 2.5. So perhaps take 2 breaks instead of having all the question and answers and the interactive discussion at the very end. Better perhaps to have a more interactive discussion in between. So after the first one, I'll make a request where we can get off the PowerPoint screen and talk a little bit, perhaps questions and answers. Next slide, please. And I leave it to you how you keep the slides and all. Next slide, please. Yes, please. Next. Okay, this is the Charter of the United Nations is one of the most crucial documents in which the self-determination is mentioned, and it became a principle of international law when the United Nations Charter was adopted in 1945. In fact, those of you who are students of politics as well, political science, and I don't know, might be interested to know the history of the United Nations. I'm not going to talk about it a lot, but try to find out all the different alliances then of the then Soviet Union and the socialist countries, and then even a personality like Eleanor Roosevelt, the spouse of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had a great deal to do with the UN as it came to be. Anyway, let's get on. Next, please. Okay, and here is the Declaration of the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, 1960s. And here, again, those of you interested in politics can look at how the 2 blocks looked at the Western democracies. Well, of course, there are alliances of African and Asian and Pacific countries and the socialists. And here you have a photograph of Fidel Castro. The gentleman without too much hair is Nikita Khrushchev. And I very much suspect the gentleman with the dark glasses is Gamal Abdel Nasser. And that was Egypt. And he was the one who fought with France and United Kingdom to retain the Suez Canal as Egyptian property. Anyway, there's a lot of history. I hope I'm not boring you with all this. Next, please. Next slide. Yes. Now, the self-determination came out in the 2 human rights covenants of 1966, which came into effect in 1976 after the requisite number of countries ratified it. And for students of human rights, it's important to remember how much of the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when these rights are to be implemented, then it's better to have them in the form of a treaty. At least with treaties, there is a monitoring mechanism. But again, for human rights, students of human rights, including indigenous people's rights, women's rights, have to remember that a lot of the formal mechanisms for scrutiny, for monitoring, etc., and the degree to which these are monitored and actually implemented at the ground level, at the country level, at the home level, at the family level, is quite complex. But I want you to be aware. Next, please. I can notice Ms. Joy Pathor. Good to see you. Now, self-determination, the Human Rights Covenant. Common Article 1 of both the 2 covenants, and I don't know the number, but I think the UN member states of 200 plus countries, actually maybe more than 80%, are parties to these covenants, although there are, for example, the optional protocol of the ICCPR, and which allows a more hands-on monitoring of the country's responsibilities. Many countries have not have not become party to these additional sub-treaties. So I'm sure Many of you are aware of many of these protocols. These are just annexes to the main agreement or treaty. We deal sometimes with procedure, we deal sometimes with substance. Like the US government was a member of the UNFCCC, but it did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So these are things you have to know as students of human rights and indigenous rights and women's rights. So this is, I am not reading the language because you must have read it many, many times. And so all peoples have the right to self-determination, and how it is phrased here. And from here, we borrow that and bring it into Article 3 of the UN Declaration. But please also note, apart from how it's been phrased in sub-article 1, that you also see the second lane, where all peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural resources and natural wealth and resources. In no case may a people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. So if it concerns a people's means of subsistence, then this is like non-derogable instruments. Like in human rights, there are certain rights, even in terms of war, you cannot derogate from. You cannot say, no, 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 I will not adhere to it, I will not honor it. So this is something very crucial. And here you actually have what Professor Erica Irene Dias, I can't pronounce it, Elsa can, because that's Greek, and I think Elsa's guru, our guru too, the grandmother of the United Nations. I have very fond memories of her. You can see that. I made a film. I'll give you the film. You can see her with us. Anyway, so she calls it Indigenous Peoples' Permanent Sovereignty over Land. And also, many of the articles, 25 to 30 of the UN Declaration, dealing with lands, territories, and resources. So relate that customary law. So this is really a very, very crucial element of indigenous peoples' rights to lands and territories. And in the days of climate change, now the challenges that we are facing, that indigenous peoples are in occupation of more than 80% of the world's most biodiverse areas. So we matter a great deal to the climate change challenges too. Next, please. Next slide. Can we have that? Okay, just very briefly. The Human Rights Declaration, known the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action of 1993, that was very important, and that referred to self-determination, as it also referred to women's rights. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Now, back, please. Can we go back to the previous slide? Yes. And now, so the treaty monitoring bodies, particularly the Human Rights Committee on the ICCPR, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights on the ICESCR, and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, ICERD. There is jurisprudence on the right to self-determination. And the UN Declaration of 2007 makes it absolutely clear that this right applies to indigenous peoples. Next, please. Now, I will not get into the details of this. And so there is, on the left, the Human Rights Committee, which have these very important cases that those of you interested, you can look at on self-determination. Micmac versus Canada, 1984. Keetok versus Sweden, 1988. And Lubicon Cree Band versus Canada, 1990. That's in the Human Rights Committee. Then in the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, we have a General Comment number 21 on cultural rights and right to self-determination. And in third committee, where our present special rapporteur on Indigenous peoples, where he was the chair of CERT for a long time. Uh, did some wonderful work. And anyway, you have Finland on the Sami parliament, right to self-determination. There was an interesting case. But the person who was really, really extremely well-versed with, and I would say an expert on Indigenous people's rights and treaty monitoring bodies is Fergus Mackey from Aotearoa, who's a Maori lawyer. So he has some publications, some are available on the net. I would very much urge you to look at them. Many of you, or most of you, have probably done that. Next, please. Now, the question of Indigenous peoples, the right of self-determination applying or not applying to Indigenous people was an extremely hotly debated issue in the UN Working Group on the Draft Declaration, 1984, around that time, to the 1990s, before the subcommission came in and there was a special working group. Anyway, the whole question was the right. So did they, when they drew the Charter of the United Nations, 1945 or so, did they have Indigenous peoples in mind or not? Now, whether or not they had Indigenous peoples in mind, with a document of universal application, it would be very difficult for a United Nations body to today say that no, this relates to all peoples except Indigenous peoples. So non-Indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. Indigenous peoples do not. So that would be very, very, we did not say all UN member states have the right to self-determination. It is peoples who have the right, not states, not territories. So this is something we consistently argue. And I was there for, I can't remember anyway. Remember that this debate, the working group has been going on for 20 something years. Many people died well before the subcommission came in, but did their bit, put in their commitments, put in a lot of things. So it was many people from many generations, a lot of Indigenous people, but many also non-Indigenous women and men who did. So anyway, so I'm just, these are all coming through my mind, you see. And so some of you may have seen a film, very amateur film I made on a preparatory meeting in Mexico, where you see many of the people who were really the top, Madame Dias to Special Rapporteur Cobo's most senior ally from Guatemala. I forget his name now, but it come anyway. So next, please. Now, right to self outcome document. The outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, and this followed the ALTA preparatory meeting of Indigenous Peoples, which actually followed regional Indigenous Peoples meetings in the Americas, in Pacific, Oceania, Africa, Europe, and Asia. So we all had our own meetings, and we met in Alta, and we gave our own declaration calling for a world conference, and a world conference happened. Perhaps that might have disappointed many people. That was not a world conference in the sense of fanfare with thousands of people mulling around, but it was actually a part of a UN General Assembly meeting in very boring UN headquarters in New York. But the most important thing was that here was an unwritten understanding that the World Conference would not adopt any document which did not have the concept. But the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, actually, the draft, and I had the good fortune and the honor to be the co-chairperson of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus of the Draft Declaration Working Group. The other co-chairperson was from Latin America. His name will come. I haven't met for so many years. His son is now an activist. Jose Carlos Morales. And so the draft we sent was, that is like 70%, 80%, or 80 something percent, which was agreed to by the indigenous peoples, but there were certain things changed by the chair and by the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. But when the World Conference came in, there was a clear understanding, if not in writing, that no, you General Assembly members, you constitute the membership of the UN, and it is you who vote, you adopt, we do not. But you will please not adopt a single word that we did not acquiesce with, that we did not agree to. So anyway, so indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising the right to develop. This is paragraph 37. Next please. I'll try to speed up. And I won't read here everything. Now, this is with regard to free, prior, and informed consent on two matters. Paragraph 3 deals with the adoption and implementation of legislative and administrative measures that may affect indigenous peoples, whereas paragraph 20, that deals with their FPIC regarding their approval of any project affecting the lands and territories and resources. Next, please. Next slide, please. It's not moving. Yes. Now, this is something indigenous peoples probably come up with time and time again, and particularly in Africa and Asia, where states always question, and government officials, military, police, bureaucrats, even politicians, when they say self-determination, they're still stuck with an image. The self-determination movement means somebody running around with a submachine gun fighting military troops to secede from an existing state and create another independent country. Yes, it can mean that. Bangladesh is an example of two limbs of self-determination. One, because Bangladesh had a history, long history, which made it legitimate for it to become a country separate from Pakistan. Bangladesh was with Pakistan until 1971. But Bangladesh was also oppressed severely, militarily. There was raid, etc., by Pakistani military forces, which would still have triggered off the right of self-determination because the state treats you very, very badly. So there are different elements of self-determination. I do not want to use phrases, but some people call it remedial, some people call it direct, whatever it is. But the fact is that the right of self-determination may be there, meaning depending on what you mean by self-determination in the context of self-governance, autonomy, statehood, etc. But it is there. But when a state ceases to be democratic and excludes you and oppresses you, then that can also give right to a self-determination right to secede from that country. But again, self-determination is not just the creation of a state. You exercise it, if you recall Common Article 1 of the two covenants and Article 3 of UN Declaration, that you freely pursue your political status. You freely determine your political status and freely pursue your economic, social, and cultural development. So these limbs of self-determination are continually exercised and practiced and enjoyed by peoples, including indigenous peoples. Next, please. Yes, sir. Thank you. So I'll be brief and say that, so in most cases today, it's how do we uh, exercise this trust within an existing state. Uh, so there are many, many aspects of also exercising this right. And in fact, the right of a people to self-determination, particularly indigenous peoples, and how uh, this intersects with women's rights, elderly rights, children rights is still a very complex and problematic issue where we have to deal with. This goes for many, many places. And uh, I am in Nepal. There are some of you from Nepal. And I have done some study and writing on the new constitution of Nepal. And there are these protected areas, etc., which have not been invoked. People have forgotten about them. But I think recently there was some case, I think in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Nepal had instructed the government to pass laws. You just have the skeleton. You just have the framework of two-story building or three-story building. But you have to know how many rooms there are going to be, what's the furniture going to be like, and all that. So that's where actually I have mentioned later. I'm writing about a Chakma people. It will come in a publication soon. That let us look at how also these people are exercising the right to self-determination. Unfortunately, I feel unfortunately that I do not read Spanish. That so I miss out a lot of the self-determination in Panama, Cunayala, Bolivia, to many of the South American countries as well, where there is autonomy legislation from Mexico in North America to right down to the very south. Next, please. So, gender equity, gender equality is one growing, continuing struggle within indigenous peoples. Now I come to the international arena. So, so there can be certain uh, certain context in which indigenous peoples operate in the international arena. Well, when we go to the permanent forum or the expert mechanism, that is the international arena. Uh, so there are many other areas so where we act as an entity. So let's have a look, please. Next slide. Now I am giving you here the three examples. The one on the right, if you look at the yellow, is indigenous passports. Then in the middle is Arctic Council, and the right is international sporting events. Now with indigenous passports, I remember our friends from the Haudenosaunee, and please correct me if I'm wrong, they have a confederacy. It is along the US and Canada border from the New York area right up to, I don't know, Quebec, where these different indigenous nations, First Nations, are there. And many of them used to attend UN meetings in Geneva carrying their own passports. Not Canadian passport, not American passport, but indigenous passport. And then Swiss government allowed them. Perhaps not anymore. And I think there have been one or two, some sporting events. Now I move to the right, you see, in Scandinavia, where they went with their own passports. So there are international sporting events where sports is held. There have been even, I think, indigenous Olympics. No, but let me move to the central, the Arctic Council. Now, this is, you may know that the council dealing with, it has 6 indigenous peoples organizations with the status of permanent participants. And there they are sitting side by side with member states, including the US and Canada and Russia. We'll see that in the next slide, I think. Some of these organizations from the left Aleut, an organization of the Aleut. The central is the Inuit. Then with the, I forget how to pronounce it, Quechin, I think, Council. I think Alaska, the Arctic Athabascan Council, Sami Council from Scandinavia, and Raipon from Russia. So these countries sit with the governments when they deal with the environmental issues of the Arctic. And I was told by some of our friends from Arctic Scandinavia that the Chinese governments were trying to woo the indigenous people. For them, I don't know if they have got observer status in the Arctic Council or not, because with the melting ice and snow, the Bering Sea is much more navigable. So the Chinese, for the trade purposes of wanting to enter that area, so here they have to deal with not just the states, but with the indigenous as well. Next, please. And also remember Greenland. They have their own. Greenland is considered to be outside the European Union for trade purposes. They had their own mission in Brussels dealing with trade issues. And I do not know. And I have been told that they are not keen to become independent because then it's a question of money. Who will fund the airports and the roads, fisheries, hospitals? Same with certain Pacific islands, which are administered by France. Anyway, now the exercise of an indigenous people's right to self-determination is often linked very closely with how it's able to maintain a certain freely molded identity or not. And this is very, very important. Now, I don't know if there is here anybody from Northeast India. The Naga people's right to self-determination. They had a long war. They have a ceasefire with the NSCN has a ceasefire with the government of India, but there is no legislation yet on what form of self-determination or autonomy the Naga people will exercise. And this is so much related to their identity. And I'm glad that at least with Nepal, the new constitution, I know many people, it falls below the expectations of a lot of people. But at least in theory, all people's languages are state languages in Nepal. Whereas as a Bangladeshi, I am ashamed to say that because of the Bangladeshi Bengali language movement, 21 February is International Mother Language Day. Our constitution still does not mention it. And there are only 5 indigenous peoples whose we have books in the primary school in our language, in some cases script. Anyway, so this identity, language, in fact, for me, sometimes much more than political rights is identity, our own people are ceasing to speak their languages. And this is, I think, the 3rd year of the UN Decade on Indigenous Languages. We are forgetting our language and taking mainstream languages, words on board. Many of our old customs are being lost. So identity to me, as a Chakma, as a Jumma in Bangladesh, and I have seen this in various degrees in other countries, is extremely important. If we lose this struggle to retain our identity, we have lost all, no matter what is written in international law or in our national constitutions and laws and structures. Next, please. Territoriality, customary law, justice system, etc. These are the very important rights, language I've spoken about. I won't speak much about. And the book is my book on Chakma languages, published by Chakma self-government, is published by AIPP. You can have a look at it. Next, please. Okay, I think we can take a short break from the slide. I don't know, depending on the time, 5 to 10 minutes, we get off the PowerPoint. We'll come back to the PowerPoint after this break. And in this, perhaps we can have a little bit of interactive discussion. And I want to open the floor, and please feel free to either ask me a question or to share your views, particularly on the political elements of self-determination, how politicians look at it, how indigenous leaders look at it, how indigenous women are playing their role in our people's right to self-determination. Where are the women? Where are the men? Anyway, there are many, many things, but you are free. This is just a suggestion, and so open for questions and comments, discussion.
Thank you, Chief. It's good to have you back this year as well. Sisters, if you have any questions, comments, or any reflections, please feel free to just unmute your microphones or raise your hand and share. Anima, please go ahead.
Good evening, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
hear you.
Okay. Good evening, sir, and good evening to all my sisters here. I just wanted to share, that I felt more connected because you mentioned that you worked for Bangladesh, and I'm from Tripura, which is in India. So it's very close, as in we share, I think, the longest border. So that's why I was feeling more connected when you started talking about a little bit experience, you had. So I was just trying to understand more, like, how will that be applicable? I mean, even here, Tripura being a very small state, we are already struggling with our own indigenous, identity in our own state, wherein, that a lot of, we have a lot of people coming from Bangladesh as well, and that's when we become minority in our own state. So I'm sure you're well aware about the situation here in Tripura. So that makes me quite interested to know about your own views, how you look at the indigenous people in Tripura on their survival, even in terms of political, because you spoke about that. So I just wanted to know your perspective on that. Thank you.
Shall I give a response straight away?
Yes, please, Chief.
Yes, Anima Debarmaji, yeah, I feel very, very connected. Of course, we have a very long border. In Chittagong Hills, right, the Kokborok speaking peoples are the third numerous people. The Chakma speaking people are the third numerous indigenous people in Tripura state. And our friendship, if I use the word Tripura, and Chakma and other, we use the generic name of Jumma for the 11 indigenous people, the hill tribes, goes back hundreds of years. So I met the former, he would have been king of Tripura if there was the monarchy, Pradut Manika. He actually now he's head of the second largest political party in the Tripura parliament. And so we have third generation plus many, many generation of friendship between the rulers, the chiefs, and the people of Tripura state. And it is very painful for me, actually, where actually an independent kingdom, where the king was an indigenous person. And some of the subjects were non-indigenous persons, including Bengali-speaking people now in Bangladesh. That is not restricted to Tripura state only. in many parts of northeast or Nepal, from Cambodia. There are these examples, but anyway, it's the where people who are a sovereign state ran the state. It had relations with the Mughal Empire, the Burmese, and Northeast India. Now are a minority in their own state, and now they are struggling. Some of them are struggling to retain some of their lost autonomy in a demand.
Chief, Chief, I'm so sorry, we cannot hear you.
Like,
Chief, can you please kindly unmute?
yeah, I am unmuted, but I have no idea how much you did hear and how much you didn't hear.
Oh, I think we missed the last few sentences,
Okay.
Chief.
Right. So the indigenous peoples of Tripura, particularly the Kokborok speakers, of which our sister is one, Mr. Burma, and they're leading the struggle for a greater Tipra land, for greater autonomy in a state which there was a king, they had their own indigenous king, with vast territorial estates in Bangladesh today, and with contributions to Bengali literature as well. So the Bengalis have to thank the Tripura king for Rabindranath. You know about Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate from Bengal. He went and took the hospitality of Tripura Maharaja for a long time. So many of the poetry he wrote was while he was sitting in Tripura state. Anyway, so as an indigenous person, as a human rights activist, my heart goes out to the people of Tripura state in their struggle for greater Tripura land. And I am very happy that the leader has said this is not with violence. They are doing a constitutional struggle to obtain what they want. But I'm very happy that this came about here so that we get to know about different people's struggles, and we relate it to the Article 3, Article 4, and many other articles I will speak about a bit later. So any other question, comment, please?
Prema?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Please go ahead, Prema.
Yes. So I have, it's not a question, just I wanted to know his ideas or thoughts about it. Like when we're talking about self-determination and self-autonomy, about indigenous people, it's more about a community thing. And especially for indigenous women and indigenous youth myself, even within indigenous people and within our community, most of our leading institution, most of our indigenous institution doesn't really give that much spaces to indigenous women and indigenous youth. That's why even within our community, sometimes we have to like really ask our elders to include the women and include youth in the decision makings, include youth in the discussions in these traditional institutions. And it kind of becomes very tiring for us, especially youth, and me as a youth girl. It becomes very tiring to continuously ask for those spaces within our indigenous community. Despite being despite being our culture very driven and led by indigenous women, but these kind of our internal institutions really have that kind of challenges. And I just wanted your thoughts on what other indigenous community relates to these kind of situations or not, or just your thoughts on overall these kind of situation. And also to add a bit on Nepal context, this is starting another questions as well. So a bit of sharing on Nepal context of indigenous land issue. We do have indigenous people recognized by our constitutions and national indigenous acts. But still, in case of the law on providing land to indigenous community, we have written in our land policy, we have something like written in text, there is the provision for land to the landless communities. People who are landless, they are provided land by the government. So when that kind of policy comes in act, it becomes very controversial for indigenous people because we are actually not landless. We are actually the custodians of the land. So when we try to get our land under that category, it kind of devalues our original meaning, the way we consume our land and the way we protect our territories. That kind of devalues these kind of policies, and these kind of terminology devalues our main concept of why we own the land. So how your also your take on these kind of situations and how we go on about changing these kind of policies? Thank you.
Firstly, a little bit of an apology to our sisters from Latin America and Africa. My lack of knowledge about your situations and Pacific also, if there's anybody. And I really am very keen to read up more so I can engage much more with the case of Latin America and Africa. I'm familiar a little bit because of the customary law with the chief system and all. But anyway, coming back to Pimaji, firstly, yes, I absolutely agree with you on two things. One, this landless thing is it's ridiculous. And in my country and region too, we are having to deal with issues when some bureaucrat is asking me, where is your land title? What land title? In fact, this is, I hope Elsa is listening, even at the level of conceptual level, the whole question of providing a land title is something related to exchange in a market economy. Do I have to have a land title for my grandmother's cemetery or graveyard? For my sacred mountain? For my burial grounds? Whatever it is. Title is something which came in when the European industrial revolution came in and the market economy came in, where everything had to be belong to somebody or the other to trade and sell. I don't sell heritage. I don't sell forests. I don't sell I don't even sell my house in the old days. You sold other lands. You sold your shop lands. You didn't sell your homelands where you grew up. So this is a very non-indigenous perspective. And to the opposite is you have a landmark case, and I hope you have read it probably, but or you will read it, which is in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Awastingni community versus Nicaragua, whatever the title is, where Professor James and I, former special rapporteur, was the legal counsel. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights said that the rights of the Awastingni community in Nicaragua predates the Nicaraguan state. Therefore, the Nicaraguan state cannot extinguish the rights of the Awastingni community. And actually, I actually flew there with the very senior leader of FIMI and now heading our the IFAD, Indigenous Peoples Forum, our sister Dr. Aminna Kuningen. So her community, Awastingni, we went in a helicopter, and where she was a guerrilla too. Anyway, Mirna Kuningen, and so that tells you. And there's also the Mabo cases in Australia. You know this. What is it? Terra nullius, nobody's land. The white Australian settlers said, "You don't have a title, therefore it's not your land. It's nobody's land. It's open to the Queen of England, to the King of England to distribute it." It's ridiculous. And although I support the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of Philippines, where it gives out titles for ancestral domain and ancestral land. So many of you may be familiar with the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of 1997 in the Philippines. But in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, I have not written much, but I have written some. And maybe perhaps people who are better at writing with more academic uh, experience and knowledge and research could do that. I disagree with the title thing. And we have in the Chittagong Hill Tracts lands which is under nobody's title. So what we have instead of title is a safeguard saying that this forest belongs to this community, but without title. And no individual or corporate entity or a state entity may assume ownership and management of this forest without the consent. It doesn't say free prior, so I would not make it FPIC, but it means something in the nature of FPIC, without the consent of the community. So we have a case of where practicing non-title custodianship, managerial rights and use rights and everything except the right to mortgage it and sell it. We do not want to mortgage our conservation. And that's what also goes in the case of intellectual property. The people are saying that, look, this is heritage, not property. Property can be sold, the right to how you make Kentucky Fried Chicken or not, or Coca-Cola in Atlanta. But heritage cannot be sold. So this is where actually we indigenous peoples also have to get into the whole climate change debate of indigenous knowledge, how we first retain our knowledge for ourselves. Then we retain it for entire humanity. And then we exercise that knowledge to protect our forests, deserts, tundra, whatever it is, oceans, for the sake of humanity. And I think time is running out for that. Anyway, I'll get back to the slides too. But before ending, I want to say one more thing. I don't know, in my slides, there is something. What I said, I agree with another point. Yes, indigenous women and indigenous peoples. In the vast majority of situations I have seen here, the few exceptions are perhaps to an extent Philippines. In some cases of the Maori, in some cases of Scandinavia, Sami. A few cases in Latin America, but I'm so happy that Fimi is our host today. Fimi has done wonderful work. And Africa, there are serious, serious problems. I hope those from Africa do not mind I say that, because as I feel it as an indigenous activist. So also in South Asia, Nepal, there are serious problems. Northeast India, there are serious problems. Right from Naga territories, I went to Nagaland last year. I went to Meghalaya last year. I went to Tripura 4 years ago. I went to Mizoram last year. And I went to Cambodia recently. There are problems of indigenous peoples not doing enough to enable their women to be a strong and vital part of decision making. In the Chittagong Hill Tracts, you will find it in my publication, and I will speak a little bit if there is time. We had, indigenous chieftains. Our Chakma, we had one indigenous chieftain, Rani, in the 1830s to 1870s, who did not say yes, sir, to the British Captain Lewin, who wanted to, deny the Chakma and autonomy. And she went right up to the Governor General in Calcutta and fought. She retained her chief. And so we had another chief, women chief. And now what we have done recently in my territory where I am chief, now 1/5 of our village chiefs are women. There was 0 village chiefs 20 years ago. People said a woman cannot be village chief, village elder. But now we pushed it in a way, women and men and working together. And today we have 500, I think, or 500 or 400, I forget, I have the figures somewhere, 1/4 or 1/5 who are women. And in fact, the educational status of our women village chief, we call them Kharbari, is higher than the men. So, and also they understand more about child nutrition. They understand more about primary health care. They understand more about water. They understand more about the food and nutritional security of the family. They understand perhaps even more about the economy of a household than the men do. So it is to our own, for our own needs that we need their leadership of. There are some things the women should give the leadership. There are some things where the men should give the leadership. In something, we should forget who is a man and who is a woman, and have that person take the load of leadership. But anyway, these are things we are adding. So let us come back to the slides where we'll go through, and then we take another break and questions on that. So please, if we can go back to the PowerPoint slides, please. Okay, these are the UN Declaration articles dealing with self-determination. So I'm not going to read them line by line. So and this PowerPoint is there, and I will send the slightly changed one by tomorrow or so to Elsa and our colleagues at FEMI. So please, I urge you all, you can have a look at them. And I mentioned the articles and all that. Next, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. The preamble paragraph 17 is also very important for, and those of you who are students of human rights law, please remember that international human rights standards are the floor, not the ceiling. Meaning, if you have a right which is higher than the concerned instrument, like the UN Declaration, then the UN Declaration will not trump that provision. Yes? So in this case, it's talking about the right to self-determination, although UN Declaration mentions it. If you have it, which is of a higher standard, nobody can use this declaration to say, no, you get it something less. And most treaties have one savings clause saying that this treaty is meant to raise the standard of rights of the subjects of this treaty concerned, not to lower it. So if they have a pre-existing right, or they will acquire that right later on, this instrument cannot make it digress, make their rights lower. Next, please. This is just simple Article 3. You all know this by heart. Next, please. Yes, this is important, and particularly financing. And I think for Ms. Deb Burma, you have the Tripura Tribal Areas Autonomous District Council, TTADC in Tripura. There are also Chakma District Council in Mizoram. In Northeast India, you have many, Bodoland. And one of the problems is that they sometimes do not have sufficient resources. Sometimes the state governments do not give them budget to fulfill what they want. And this is probably going to be a challenge also in the case of the protected areas in Nepal when they finally take shape. And this is a problem across the board. I don't know how it is with Canada or the other self-ruled areas, but it's a big problem. Next, please. so this is just the example. That is that, like, we have traditional institutions or other cultural institutions, we have shamans, etc. But that does not mean that we cannot, we will participate uh, in our political rights in the state, in local government, in parliament, etc. Allow the Maori in Ottawa, they have two types of seats. If they choose to vote for the Maori, they can vote for the Maori or they can vote for the special constituency, etc. But anyway, so you can have the state institutions, culture, but you can also have your own, both ways. Next, please. Next slide. This is perhaps the only article in the UN Declaration which uses the word nation. So many of you from North America probably are familiar, not Mexico, but USA and Canada, they use the word nation. And in fact, the British, when they wrote about even the Chakma people in 1798, the first European to visit the Cherigong tracts, and his accounts are available in English language. They used to say the Chakma nation, not the Chakma people. Now they want to call it the Chakma tribe and Chakma, like so. The nation word can be used interchangeably with people. Anyway, this is concerns that about no discrimination attaching to it for the indigenous nation, community, etc. Next, please. This is very crucial, and so you don't have token uh, token people who was supposed to represent you, but actually feather their own nest, who are actually not your representatives. So this has to be very important, and we have said this to many processes. For example, in World Bank funded projects in our region, we have stopped at least one project which was not good, where they did not consult the right people. Next, please. This is about consultation, cooperation, and good faith. This is very related to the previous article and free, prior, and informed consent. And actually, this language I have told you earlier has been repeated in the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Next, please. And by the way, I have authored 2 articles on indigenous peoples, human rights and rights in Asia context. It's available in Routledge publications of some years ago. And I try to make some new editions on the concept of what is an indigenous people, etc. So you are welcome to look at that. I think it is included. If not, I will send it in the list in this PowerPoint. So this is also an element. I think it's related to self-determination. And the last on means of subsistence is actually the second limb of Article 1, Common Article 1 of the 2 human rights covenants, and it's repeated. And it says that where you are deprived of your means of subsistence, and you must get fair redress, because our sub-article 2 of the Common Article 1 of the 2 covenants just tells you will not be deprived of your means of subsistence. The question is, what happens if you are deprived? If you are involuntarily relocated, or if somebody has taken over your land, then you have to have redress. And in some of the involuntary resettlement policies, And I have had the opportunity of being involved with the drafting of reforms to the World Bank's Indigenous Peoples Policy, and Asian Development Bank, and a few others. And there, some of these provisions are there that address. So if you're given lands, it must be alternative lands must be similar to what you had earlier. Yes, please. This concerns the right to develop and housing and economic and social programs, etc. And these are also important. Yes, please. Okay, this is Articles 25 to 30. I will not mention much of that. We already discussed the issue of title, but there is the other thing that I hope you look at, both in the UN declarations. Yes, go on. Please go on. You can go on with the slides. That's all right. Both in the UN declarations as well as in ILO Convention 169 on territorial rights, and that we have to remember that it's not just a piece of land. For indigenous peoples, it's the interrelated pieces of land, ocean, sea, which we call a territory. And I would be very interested in doing research on what sort of terms indigenous peoples use in their own languages to refer to different parcels of territory. And there may be very, very nuanced understanding of territories and sub-territories and sub-sub-territories, which are related to the identities or livelihoods of different peoples. So in like the nomadic or semi-nomadic reindeer herders, the Sami in Scandinavia, the also Maasai and other communities in Kenya and other nearby Tanzania and other countries where these territorial and overlapping territorial rights, etc., are very important. But here, let me pause here a little bit on Article 34. I already mentioned that 1/5 of our indigenous women in our ancestral territory are now women, and that we deal with cases, and me as a tribal judge, and for those of you who are not aware, that at least with regard to our personal law, family law, which is marriage, divorce, child custody, inheritance, our tribal courts are the primary courts to deal with it. And this is similar to also Northeast India, most of Northeast India, and partly Sabah Sarawak in East Malaysia, Borneo, and a large part of Africa, particularly ex-British colonies, have their customary law. And in this, we are dealing, and I have, as a tribal judge, tried to initiate certain reforms for rights of women not to be forced into a marriage against her consent. The equal right of both women and men to have custody of a child. In this case, I refer to the Convention of the Rights of the Child rather than the UN Declaration or the Constitution of Bangladesh. And because otherwise, many of our patriarchal and patrilocal laws said that, customary law said that if a child is weaned, if a child stops breastfeeding, then the father would have the primary right to the child. But in most cases, they don't actually take custody. But so there are these matters also with regard to the right to divorce, the right to remarry, and much, 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 much more importantly, perhaps, or as equally importantly, is the right to inherit landed property and other property. So this is an ongoing matter that we are dealing with in Chittagong Hill Tracts. And in Tripura state, they have legislated. I'm a little concerned in Tripura state that many tribes have framed their laws in the Tripura Tribal Autonomous District Council, and if consulted by the government, they're going to pass into law, including Chakma law. But they did consult me as a as a traditional chief, although I have no jurisdiction in Tripura state or in Mizoram. They have consulted me uh, as a from my human rights background, my experience as a chief, and I have put in some suggestions. And my spouse and I have also written about the customary law rights of indigenous peoples in Bangladesh. So although and our laws, we do not follow the Bangladeshi Muslims follow Muslim law, the Christians follow codified Christian law, the Hindus follow semi-codified Hindu law. But if you're indigenous or tribal, we have our own law, and up to today, the Bangladeshi state has not interfered. So we have the self-determination to do reforms to our laws, particularly to remove gender discrimination and deal with child rights and other issues. So I am putting a lot of emphasis on this, and also because FEMI has done some really great work on this with Indigenous Women's Alliances, and there's a lot more can be done. And so I'll stop there, and just to say that there have been some very good positive developments happening in Philippines and a few other areas in South Asia. But again, I think it's Premaji from Nepal. We have to go a long, long way. I have mentioned this so we can. The 2,000 village chiefs are women. Next, please. Okay, this is with treaties, and this is particularly important for people who have political agreements. But for those of you who are not familiar with the phrase, I want to just share my idea. Now, treaties are generally those largely restricted to the North American context. The treaties between the British Queen or King and First Nations in Canada and the United States. There's also the Treaty of Waitangi between the British Queen and the Maori. But in most of the cases, there are also modern day, treaties in Canada. The numbered treaties are the old treaties. There are new treaties in North America. But there are many other treaties which are more known by the term agreements or accords. And Northeast India is a very big example. Of course, you have agreements in Nepal, a series of agreements with the Maoists, and many of which were not observed by the Nepalese state. So I worked with Nepalese parliamentarians, indigenous parliamentarians, more than 100. I have written, one of my writings is actually translated in Nepalese, where what they were supposed to get was missed out in the current constitution of Nepal. Now, you go to Northeast India, in Tripura state, you have the TNV agreement with Bijoy Rongkhal leading TNV. I think he's now with Tripura Mota. I see him on YouTube with Bubagra Radut. I don't know how much of that was followed or not followed. In the case of the Chittagong Hill Tracts, there are numerous, most important elements of our agreement in 1997. Nearly 2,000 armed guerrillas after fighting for 20 years, laid down their arms and made peace with the government of Bangladesh. I wrote about it recently. It's really extremely sad that today our element of autonomy or self-government is nowhere near the Chittagong Hill Tribes what it ought to be. And I'm very, very grateful to our brother Pancho Kali from Guatemala, the respected special rapporteur of indigenous peoples, Francisco Kali, for mentioning the Chittagong Hill Tracts agreement, its non-implementation. So this is extremely important. I will just add a little bit on other constructive arrangements. Now, there may be certain laws, regulations, which are, with the legal phrase, constructive arrangements, which are not agreements and treaties, but they implicitly contain the agreement of the indigenous peoples concerned. So these arrangements too should not be changed, amended, repealed without the consent of the people concerned. In the Chittagong Hill Trust, I would say the Chittagong Hill Trust Regulation 1900. In greater part of the northeast India, it is the inner line regulation. For many of you, it may come as a surprise that we had the inner line regulation in Chittagong Hill Tracts too. It means a non-indigenous person may not enter nor buy land in this territory without written consent of the administrative head of that unit. And theoretically, this law still applies in Mizoram to our east in India and Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, etc. So anyway, so this is something very, very important. There have been actually seminars and treaties on this, treaties, agreements, and you can avail of those documents from the Office of the Commissioner, Human Rights Commissioner. This is financial and technical assistance. This is very important. We can go on. Next, please. I have mentioned the treaty monitoring bodies of it. Next, please. Already. So I will not dwell on this. The free, prior, and informed consent. Okay, I'll speak about this, then we'll go for the next question answer break. Now, this developed in the context of the World Commission on Dams in the 2000. And it's very important that so many dams have been created without the consent of the people's concerned. So that came in, and now it's part of the UN declaration, and particularly in the outcome document of the World Conference. And then we have it also in the context of RED plus, UN RED. Now here at the national level, one of the strongest laws anywhere in the world is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of Philippines 1997, where FPIC is there. But the problem is sometimes it can be manipulated. I give you this, and hey, chief of the community or the elders or the leaders, you come and sign on this document. I'm going to have a tin mine here. And this particularly has happened in the context of the Philippines for in many ways. So where actually they would not have given their consent if there had been no manipulation. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so you see that free, prior, informed consent is the UN declaration. outcome document, the Indigenous Peoples Policy of the World Bank, of the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank in a different way, UN Red and Red Plus. I was there also in the redrafting of the International Finance Corporation. For those of you who are not aware of these Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank lends to governments mostly, and the regional banks, African, Asian, Inter-American, lend to governments mostly in their regions. But the International Finance Corporation lends to private companies, corporations. So that also is a very big player in international development. But here, let me confess my ignorance that I am not familiar with the African Development Bank, but I suspect that because of the whole issue of, similarly to Asia, African governments insisting that everybody is indigenous, we don't have indigenous people, or everybody is indigenous, although I think the constitution of Kenya does mention marginalized communities or to the similar terminology. And so African Asian governments say it too. So I don't know actually. So those of you who are from Africa perhaps know not more than me, but I suspect that the indigenous peoples there is no separate indigenous peoples policy for the African Development Bank now, and so that is a difficult for you. In the case of the World Bank, because there is an indigenous peoples policy, we stopped a border roads project in our region, and we went right up to Washington D.C. and we stopped the project. Now Bangladesh government may finance its own roads, but World Bank is not coming because it violated indigenous peoples policy of the World Bank. It also violated many other policies. So those of you who are into human rights and development, I would urge you to work closely at all these safeguard policies on involuntary resettlement, culture, forest, etc. And we, with the Asian Development Bank, we did the opposite. We from the Chittagong Hill Tracts lobbied Manila, headquarters of the Asian Development Bank, and said these are the policies you have. So you have to support the Chittagong Hill Tracts Accord of 1997. And in fact, so we had a post-accord project which actually said to underpin the accord. So it's one of the very few exceptions where the Asian Development Bank actually did a project in which was actually to benefit the indigenous peoples, right? Rather than, you have these adverse developments, adverse impacts of projects funded by Asian Development Bank and World Bank. So, and this ADB funded project is coming in its, I think, third or fourth incarnation, hopefully still with good things, including compensation for customary law lands for which the family or individual or community has no written title issued by the state. And so in the last phase of the project, we lobbied Manila and our government, and they put it into the agreement between the government and the World Bank. And so we have the communities getting some compensation. But so those in Africa would urge you, and although this is not directly related to self-determination, but still these rights are all connected, and I would still urge you all to be familiar with these institutions' policies, how they interact with indigenous people's rights. Next, please. Okay, let's have a brief look at, and I will not go through it, but please keep it. So with UN Declaration and the outcome document of the World Conference, both dealing with FPIC. Next, please. Okay, right to consultation and participation, very briefly. Next slide, please. This is a very basic element of ILO 169. So in ILO 169, you cannot, ILO 169 is open for ratification. We have not had very many new ratifications. Nepal is the only country in Asia, along with Fiji, ratify 169. Bangladesh is party to 107, as India and Pakistan. And it's mostly Latin American countries, few European countries with 169. Next, please. I will not discuss it. So uh, if it is of any use for you, please have a look at it. That the articles of Convention 169 on consultation and participation, which is extremely important. Falling short of consent, these are also important, or even where your consent is necessary. If you are not consulted and you don't participate, then what are you going to give your consent or withdraw your consent on? Next, please. Okay, this I'll go through a few more slides for the next break. This is on self-determination, and self-determination is something where we find that a lot of government people say, I had mentioned this earlier, that this to them this is like secession, it is anti-state, etc. So they don't want to support it. And I'm just giving you some examples, but I will not discuss it too. Next slide, please. Okay, we can stop here for. There are a series of tables I have mentioned. I will not discuss it, but those of you who are interested, you can have a look at them. So these are on political and administrative autonomy, legislative autonomy, where you have the right to pass laws, like district councils in Northeast India, cultural and linguistic autonomy, language, culture are within the domain of that self-government. And free, prior, and informed consent is also there. Like the land acquisition laws of India are quite progressive. The most progressive I have seen anywhere, with Bangladesh being one of the most progressive. Consultation is very important. Tables, I will just briefly mention them. Next, please. So I have mentioned here the states in Northeast India with their constitutional dispensations are quite unique, actually. Nagaland and Mizoram in particular, and other states in Northeast India have a separate provision in the constitution. And one of the most important elements of these states is that the federalism is very different from state to state. And in the case of Nagaland and Mizoram, where it concerns ownership and transfer of land, social and religious customs, the central government of India cannot pass a law unless and until the legislative assembly of that state, Mizoram and Nagaland, says yes, then the federal parliament of India can pass a law on these items. Otherwise, it is a no-go subject for the federal government. So it is either legislated by the state assembly, or it is managed through, administered through customary law. Malaysia, the Sabah and Sarawak, and for those of you who may not be aware, Sabah and Sarawak, along with Singapore and Malaya, constituted one state in the 1950s. I forget the year. But at one stage, Sabah and Sarawak stayed on with Malaya to make it Malaysia. Singapore said we will not stay with you and made its own independent country. So, but Sabah and Sarawak have certain specific provisions on their native customary rights, land laws. They are, I think, still the majority in Sabah and Sarawak states. But for certain matters, the Malaysian government has actually uh, permeated their local autonomy, their provincial state assembly to the extent which is surprising for me as a student of political science and law to find how much a federal government, a central government can actually deny rights to a state uh, government. So very surprising. But anyway, still there are certain things which is worth looking at. Next, please. And the Philippines, I have mentioned in the north, the Cordilleras have not. I don't know. I think I noticed somebody who is from Cordillera region amongst you. So the Cordillera anyway have rejected autonomy. They have not passed. They said no in a referendum. Most of the provinces. So although the Constitution of the Philippines, you can look at Article 10, sections, etc., 115 to 19, provides for autonomy for Cordilleras and for Muslim Mindanao, which has been renamed as Bangsamoro. But in Bangsamoro, there is autonomy. There has been a peace deal. They have been fighting the Philippines government for a long time. And now there is an element of autonomy, uh, relative peace in Bangsamoro, and I visited it briefly some couple of years back. But their autonomy, there are issues, two issues which are problematic. One of them is the issue of finance, the Philippines government not giving enough to them or not having enough. The other issue is that those indigenous peoples who are not Muslim, who are not Bangsamoro, I think I forget the name, what generic name that they're called, and some of their rights have been sort of swept aside. I have heard, with neither the Philippine central government nor the Bangsamoro authorities caring much for them. So that is a case for concern. Nepal, I have mentioned a little bit earlier, the special areas, protected areas, and autonomous regions, and so these are the the provision I have mentioned, and the Supreme Court has instructed the government to pass laws, but I don't know. Perhaps laws have not been framed. And although I know that there are many things from India which may not be good for Nepal, like panchayats, but the autonomous district and regional councils under the sixth schedule to the Constitution of India, I think are one of the very good examples of devolution. Although you know how the different districts and like the Borderland Territorial Council are dealing with their issues is a different matter, but at least you have the provisions of autonomy from sometimes both the federal government as well as the state government. So the sixth schedule is actually worth looking at. I've been studying it for the last 20 years. And it is being exercised in different ways. You have to be creative. And I think in the case of Nepal too, this could be a very good role model to look at. You don't have to follow it 100%. You only take whatever is applicable to your circumstances. Next, please. And I'm not going to discuss it. So there is the India, I have mentioned Nagaland and Mizoram. These laws provide special protection. You can have a look at them. Malaysia, I have mentioned. The legislative competence is Sabah and Sarawak. Regarding legislation, there is Pakistan. I think I am a little bit not dated enough on Pakistan, but Pakistan also has legislation on tribal areas where we had tribal jirga. They were outside the jurisdiction of the uh, court system of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. And we were under these provisions once, as because Bangladesh was part of Pakistan and Chittagong Hill Tracts region was actually centrally ruled by Pakistan at one stage. Next, please. Again, this is more on cultural autonomy, linguistic autonomy, and autonomy over customary law, which they retain, which we have to a lesser extent in Chittagong tracts. And in Nepal, I mentioned the area about mother language, at least in theory it is there. And it's about culture, cultural civilization, heritage. That is a progressive terminology in the new constitution. And in Bangladesh, we have some words, and most of which is actually not, we are not happy with them, but anyway, because the government has changed some articles. Next, please. And Philippines on FPIC, they have very interesting provisions, and also on titles for ancestral domains and lands. India, I have already mentioned Nagaland and Mizoram. And in Bangladesh, although the Chittagong Hill Tracts regional and district councils are way less autonomous than, for example, the district councils in India. But then one provision on land, which is a strong safeguard we have, is that without the consent of our district councils, which are tribal-led and tribal majority 2/3, even the central government of Bangladesh cannot provide settlement of land titles or land transfer or even compulsory acquisition of land. So this is one of the strongest provisions in the CHT agreement, which has been converted into law. Next, please. And these are also matters on consultation. And this is particularly in peninsular India, like Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, etc., the tribal belt as they call it. The governor, if it's a tribal area, the governor must consult the tribal members of the legislative councils before passing laws. And then in Bangladesh, for what it is worth, we have some safeguards in the regional council, district council laws and the Chittagong Hill Tracts Regulation 1900, some of which I will mention in the forthcoming publication I mentioned with AIPP. Next, please. Let me be guided by my host. Shall I stop here and take some question, answer the comments, and then move on to the remaining slides, or should I complete them and have a discussion and then we end it?
Chief, I think we can take some questions now.
Okay.
And then we continue.
Okay. Sure. We'll come back to this.
There was a question earlier from Johnnery, and Sister Cecilia had translated it, but I'll just read the question for you, Chief. So the question is, what can we do about the violations of the self-determination of Indigenous peoples? What kinds of actions can we take when the right to self-determination has been violated?
A very crucial question. but also something it's very difficult. Now, we have to explore the different avenues that are available to us to get the remedy that we seek. Now, there are legal remedies and there are political remedies. Now, unfortunately, legal remedies, firstly, in the international context, are very limited because apart from the European system, because the way the European human rights treaty is backed by the European community with the European Council of Ministers there. Now, of course, excluding the United Kingdom. But even if you go to the Inter-American system, it has an Inter-American Commission and an Inter-American Court of Human Rights. But if a state does not implement the rulings of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, unfortunately, there's very little to do legally. You can move politically, and with sometimes governments such as the US, such a mighty government, would it just gently accept something said by the Inter-American Court or even other countries in South America? Now, we in Asia don't even have any regional body. At least in Africa, they have the African Charter and Mission on Peoples and Human and People's Rights. We have nothing. So remedies in the international human rights sphere are also limited, and very few agencies of the United Nations have teeth. So students of human rights have to first understand that in many cases, international human rights law lacks implementing executive authority and power. So yes, perhaps the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, if it can issue international summons for arrests, this can, deter many criminals or human rights violators like truant soldiers and policemen, etc., from traveling to European countries, etc. But these are limited. So in the field of human rights, at the international level, what really is important is to be creative and forge synergies and alliances with others to put pressure on your government through propaganda, through the press and media. And then again, this I may, please do not mind, I say sometimes there is too much funding to attend meetings of the Permanent Forum and EMRIC, not enough to go to WIPO or other international mechanisms which also deal with indigenous people's rights. Treaty bodies are extremely important because if you look at the Permanent Forum and expert member, many governments send very low-level diplomats to these meetings, meaning they don't really care. But if it's a treaty, if it's the Human Rights Council's UPR, if it's the human rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, or CEDAW, or CRC, and a few others, they put more weight. So we human rights activists have to be very creative in order to align ourselves with media and political actors. Now, at the national level, again, there is no magic formula to say how can we deal with violation of human rights. I'm sorry, with self-determination. You have to break up the self-determination right into manageable chunks, even if it's a bit reductionist. if it's a bit clinical and artificial, is it civil? Is it economic? Is it cultural? Is it political? And then try to invoke your national constitution and your national laws. And we have tried it in some cases in Bangladesh, where instead of citing the UN Declaration, we have also cited the UN Declaration, and in one judgment has been given even in Bangladesh. But in other cases, uh, you have to invoke national law and say, my national constitution, article such and such, which was written in 20 years ago, actually means this, which is the latest jurisprudence from the such and such treaty monitoring body, say Fergus Mackay has done research on. So, and then try to get a ruling in the Supreme Court or High Court or other superior courts of law. But per se, by itself, implementing the right of self-determination is extremely difficult, even more so in the Asian, Latin American, and African contexts. But I don't want you to lose heart that sometimes it's how your people assert your right and exercise your right with all the limitations. And in our case, our constitution says zero about indigenous peoples. It calls us something else. Doesn't mention autonomy or right to self-determination. But in the case of customary law, we are exercising our self-determination. How much, how women and men will share ancestral property, and how marriages and divorce will go on, how we will do our headships of our villages. We can do so, but of course there are no fit all answers to different contexts. It has to vary, and you have to try to explore innovative ways of dealing with these violations.
Thank you, Chief. Pema, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joy. So I just wanted to mention something. Devishi sir, before in his presentation somewhere, he mentioned that we indigenous, as we are the protectors of our land, we should not sell our resources and we should protect it and also promote it as our best practices. But adding on to that, sorry. So adding on to that, in case of my community, in Mugum community, we kind of depend on a herb called Yasha Gumba. We have a certain period of time, like in the early of year, in like 1 to 2 months, we go and collect that herb and sell it and depend on that earning for the rest of our year. So that is like our one of the main source of our earning and main source of livelihood. So we do that in a manner that we don't completely destroy that herb. We have a tradition where we have a technique where we skip a certain area, skip a certain feet, skip certain meters to make sure that in that area we are saving those herbs. And so we collect that in a manner, and we also have a certain quantity. We don't collect it more than that quantity. So we do that too, so that we save those resources for next year. We save the seeds for newer growth, and we also do in a manner that we don't hurt other herbs and other natural resources that are not that high monetarily value. So we do that collection of that herb in that way. And what happens is that there are a lot of trespassers that come before the actual time of picking up the herbs, and they come there and they do it in a very haphazard manner. They destroy all the other herbs, they destroy all the other smaller plants and smaller herbs that are not that valuable, because they don't know the value of those herbs. So we have a tradition where our youth go before the time where we actually collect the herbs. We go there and we kind of catch those thieves who trespassers who come to collect those herbs illegally. So we do that, and there are a lot of cases where our youths are hurt, where there are lots of cases where they have died protecting all these kind of resources. And so when we are saying, so this kind of, because we are using it to sell and earn our livelihood, it kind of contradicts on how that you are also using it for monetary purposes, you are also using it to gain profits. And there are kind of, that also contradicts to what you have said, like, oh, you said that we should not sell our resources, we should protect it. So it has that kind of contradiction. So I'm very confused on, because we are also protecting it and we are consuming in a very sustainable manner. So so right now we also have to pay taxes to the government for the amount of the herb that we have collected, and we are going to sell it. So those taxes are actually not used for our own community. So we are currently trying to advocate for recognition of recognition of all the contributions of our community to protect those herbs and to protect our resources, and actually translate that in a manner that the contribution, the taxes that the government is collecting is also used in that particular, in our community, in our area. So we are currently trying to advocate that in our village. But I just wanted to know on how do we go on about, like, how do we tell, how do we talk to our state that we are also the protectors of our land, though we also consume it, but it is kind of our only risk, because we have been dependent on that for like throughout the histories. We do depend on that particular earning and that particular collection of herbs for our livelihood, to sustain our life throughout the rest of the year. So how do we go on about advocating for both of the things and also continuing our earnings? So that's what I wanted to ask.
Thank you, Vimaji. I'll try to give a response. Now, when I said about not selling our resources, I was actually mainly meaning not selling our land title, not other resources if we can use them for our livelihoods in a sustainable manner. So many of our people in our region do swidden cultivation. Some people call it shifting cultivation, where you'll have to burn a patch of forest or growth, bamboo, etc. But many of our people sell bamboo shoot. Many of our people sell broom, to sweep the. Well, they even grow. It grows wild, but we also grow it. Anyway, even timber. Some people grow trees for selling, but not the entire forest. So the question is, livelihood must come first. And if it is done in ecologically sound manner, where it grows back again, then there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. That sort of livelihood should grow, and both the state and those outside people who enter your territory to unsustainably use it, and your state to tax you but not give anything back in return to you, are taking the wrong perspective. And I think we also have to be a little bit savvy. We have to be a little bit, be clever enough to know how to package our own lifestyles, that we are truly doing it for our own benefit, but as well as it's sustainable, it'll go through a few generations. And also tell the state that, look, if you do not support our livelihood security and you do not prevent all these outsiders from coming in unsustainably uh, uh, using our territories, then we are going to become poorer and poorer. And if we become poorer and poorer, when we will have to sell everything in front of us in order to just get some food into our stomachs. So I think if you showcase your sustainable ways, then uh, gradually, hopefully, the government will come to understand. But I have all my respect for all your youth who even gave their lives for protecting your resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Professor Elsa, were you going to say something? Uh, Sisters from Latin America and Africa have been quite quiet today. So I would just like to open this space for any sister from Latin America and Africa. If you have any questions or reflections or anything you would like to share, please go ahead. Yeah, Medali, please go ahead.
Sí, muy buenos días.
Yes, good day to everyone,
Y también a nuestro maestro
and
ponente.
good day to our presenter and teacher today.
Anteriormente,
Previously,
él ha comentado que no sabía un poco de
you commented
esto del manejo de los territorios
that
en
you
Perú.
weren't quite sure how things were done here in Latin America or in Peru. I can tell you a little bit about Peru because I'm from Peru.
Entonces,
So
anteriormente, con respecto a las
previously, when we were talking about the land,
del presidente, de un presidente de apellido Velasco,
before the President Velasco here, the
comunales, ¿no? Y el campesino solamente
land was in the hands of large landowners, and farmers were just peons, and we were working for the large landowners. But once President Velasco came to power, he said that the land was for those who work it,
los campesinos,
in this case, the farmers. And since then,
la palabra del presidente
we
es
have
campesinos, indígenas, ¿no?
all the indigenous farmers in the area have some territory where we can grow our food. But what happens is that until today, we still don't have titles for our land. This is a huge problem for us.
Si bien es cierto, hay
And while it is true that there are areas
de San Martín,
where, for example, the area of San Martin, which is a department of the country or a province, you're seeing a lot of abuses on the part of the big industries, the big corporations. They come and they do a lot of destructive things to the land. And so people are having to fight to have their lands protected, the lands that they should have legal title to at this point. And that's a huge problem in Peru. And many people have even lost their lives, as you've mentioned, for trying to defend their land. And every time we meet with sisters in this area, this topic always comes up in San Martin. And so they are very strong that they want to have their territory and they want to defend it because there is a problem with water as well. The water is now contaminated. And this, of course, has a negative effect on the health of the population. And so that's our concern in terms of the land. And another problem is that currently in the area of Puno, where I live in the Puno region, we are engaged in a work stoppage right now because we are rejecting the current government. And we have seen how discrimination has increased, racism has increased, even in the president himself. And there have been other people who haven't been perfect, perhaps, but they came from the rural areas and they have been in favor of the people in the rural areas, in the small towns, in the agricultural areas. And when he came to government, they blocked him at every way they could. And there was so much racism. So they rejected him, and we have felt rejected as well. In Puno, we have a whole indigenous culture. We have Quechuas and Aymara, peoples, a variety of cultures, and we have all felt affected by this racism. And so we are fighting to be respected and fighting not to be discriminated against. And beyond the political aspects, right, which is a whole other issue. So that's what I can tell you a little bit about Peru in terms of territories and the defense that we are trying to do of our lands. So I just wanted to talk about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Is there anyone else talking now?
No, Chief, I do not see any hand up. Should we go back to the presentation, Chief?
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment. I must say, and although I have had the pleasure and honor of meeting brothers and sisters who are Quechua and Aymara, there is translation of yo comprendo poquito español porque
I
yo no
understand
hablo.
just a little bit of English. Sorry, Spanish is what I meant to say.
Yo no hablo español.
So
It's very touching to hear our sister from the Puno region, and I'm going to definitely try to read up and understand more. I have met Quechua and Aymara brothers and sisters in international meetings, so I'm very grateful to Medelith Rivera for enlightening me about the problems created by President Velasco and also the discrimination and how the people of the Puno region, amongst others, I'm sure it's a very beautiful region, are resisting this racist and discriminatory acts. All I can say is my respects to your people in bravely struggling for your people's identity and rights and resisting these very discriminatory acts on your lands and territories. And I will try to read up on Peru and the Puno region to try to understand more. Thank you very much. We can maybe go back to, I will speed up the slides, the remaining slides I have. Thank you. Okay, here is a little bit on the gender dimensions of indigenous peoples' self-determination, some of which I have already discussed. We can go on with the slide, please. Next slide. And among the challenges I have mentioned, in case you are not clear, I had spoken earlier, is that with representation, we have serious problems that in many cases, women are not represented at all or are underrepresented in regards to representation, external representation, but also decision making in general, from the family level to the village level to county, district, province level. And people try to sometimes talk about the people's movement and rights, but just brush under the carpet the discrimination that is meted out to the women of their communities. So until and unless the more those who are in power realize how it is to be powerless, then you cannot expect the women to be able to speak, for example, articulately and with courage in a clear manner. And we have seen it in our territory, where I was saying that 20 years ago we had 0. Now in our territory we have 500 women who are village chiefs, and they are speaking in front of microphones, and they are arguing sometimes with the soldiers and paramilitaries, and they are arguing with their own men or others in order to obtain, bring forth a rights or development remedy or solution that is best for all. So I won't go back and discuss much more, but I think that all of our movements in different parts of the world really have to be very honest with the gendered element of our people's struggles, where we are sometimes behaving almost like the oppressor, but within our own indigenous communities. Okay, let me go on with the remaining slides, please. So economic rights, I'm just trying to artificially divide these rights. So sometimes it can help. Sometimes when you put it as a right, nobody pays attention. But sometimes when you say, hey, Sustainable Development Goal, SDG, oh, then it links up. So many of the socio-economic rights that are in the UN Declaration and other instruments, we have to rephrase them in the context of the SDGs in your countries, etc. Next, please. Next. And then I have mentioned the personal laws, gender, and how the courts, tribal courts and national courts deal with women's issues. There are examples in both Bangladesh, Northeast India, and Africa on these tribal courts. And in the case of Chittagong Hill Tracts, I mentioned the Karbaris. Next, please. Next slide. And then regarding cultural rights, we need support from states, and this is, I'm saying that is one of the weakest flanks of our indigenous bodies, where sometimes it is very difficult to attract finances from the state or donor agencies, and where we are losing the ethos, the main basis of our culture, of collective entity, of a collective way of supporting individual farmers or a village, the vulnerable groups, and also many things in our oral songs and music and poetry, and also in our writings, those of us who use writing for our culture, that if we do not take care of that, then others will not take care, and we will lose it, and we will lose the very identity. Next, please. And in the cultural rights sphere, I have mentioned that linguistic and other cultural rights, also biodiversity, etc., that we have to speak out on this. And I was recently in IFAD along with Mirna Cunningham, and we shared about our indigenous knowledge, how we conserve nature and forests. And we did a similar thing in Glasgow at the climate change conference. Some of the indigenous elders got together, and there was somebody from the Andean highlands. I don't know if Peru is also part of the Andes. Chile is, and there was somebody from also in the mountains of Nepal, and Sami, and from Nunavut in Canada, Inuit. We shared our stories, but not just our stories, that we basically said that what we know, that others need to know, because this is going to benefit all of us together. Next, please. And civil rights also, these are extremely important, because if we cannot exercise them, then our indigenous identity, or even just as citizens, is difficult. And so in Bangladesh, we sometimes forge alliances with other civic rights groups. They are from the mainstream community, like women's groups, minorities groups, environmentalists, so that then our group becomes stronger when we talk about civil rights, political rights, etc. And then in the political sphere also we have challenges. Next, please. States often, when we say self-determination, they smell secessionism, they smell violence and all that. And but we have to assert our right and not be shy about asserting our self-determination rights. Next, please. And here is a quote, I will not read it. He was the first special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Professor Rodolfo Stavenhagen. And he wrote that it is the denial of self-determination much more which creates violence than actually asserting the right to self-determination. He was a very able special rapporteur professor from Mexico for 2 terms. Next, please. Next slide. And I will say a little bit, I have ended, but actually I could not send it, but at Elsa's request, I added some points which I cannot show you, but I will talk. I will just mention it on enhanced right of indigenous peoples in the UN system. So if you will please bear with me a little bit, I will just discuss that a bit. I am just trying to find the slides. Okay, I will mention a bit about the enhanced participation. Now, some of you are perhaps aware that the United Nations was not open to indigenous peoples historically. And when it was the League of Nations, we had this famous chief, Descahe, from, I forget, he's from Canada or US. Anyway, there's this Iroquois Confederacy. He was a hereditary chief like me, and he had some issues. They had some issues with how I think the Canadian government was dealing with the First Nations, and he wanted to complain to the League of Nations before the United Nations in 1923. And so he went to Geneva, and he spent a year or so there, but he made various speeches, met many leaders. He convinced many people to support him, but formally the League of Nations did not. But he left behind a huge legacy of his people's struggles. So he is one of the first pioneers amongst indigenous peoples at the UN, and followed by Chief Leader Ratana, a religious leader from a Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand, in 1924 and 25. He was in Geneva. And he too spoke about his people's rights. Now, let's fast forward it to the 20th century, the first time that indigenous peoples, along with other non-state bodies, addressed the United Nations was in the first Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, where indigenous peoples became recognized one of the 9 major groups, like industry, farmers, etc., who could participate in the World Conference, which is also a meeting of the United Nations. Now, actually, we find that the doors have opened wider. Of course, we have the Permanent Forum and Emirate, Special Rapporteur, and with treaty bodies, we have the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity, where indigenous peoples are participating along with other observers in various deliberations. In WIPO, we have some sort of a status to participate. Then there is the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, in which too indigenous peoples have representation at the highest levels. Then in the International Fund for Agriculture Development, there is the Global Forum, of which Minna Kuningen is now the chair, and there is also another body deal with indigenous peoples to support indigenous organization with small grants. Then there is UNESCO has its own special system of indigenous participation. And of course, we have Permanent Forum since 2002, expert mechanism since 2007, and UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People since 2001. Now, then came the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Now, before that, I told you about the regional indigenous peoples preparatory meetings, and then the final global preparatory meeting in Alta, Norway on 10th and 12th June 2013. When was it? Just before 2017. I've lost it. I think it was 2016. Anyway, we had the Alta conference, we have the Alta outcome document, and then we had the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in New York. And one thing was there, that there was a clear understanding that there would be no adoption of a declaration without the consent of the indigenous peoples. And before the World Conference actually happened, which was a UN General Assembly special session, there were preparatory meetings happening, and I was among many people from different parts of the world who participated in drafting groups to get the draft ready for the final discussions of the World Conference. But one thing that came screaming out from all the regions and at Alta was that indigenous people's participation at the United Nations must be substantive. It must be open. It must be fair. With the Permanent Forum, too, it is quite open-ended. Unlike in, say, other bodies of the Economic and Social Council or the Human Rights Council, you do not have to be an specially accredited NGO in order to participate. So in the Permanent Forum and Emirate, we can go as indigenous persons, indigenous peoples, and indigenous parliamentarians have a special status at the Permanent Forum. So these issues came in, and then finally, World Conference came, and then the General Assembly resolution of 8th September 2017. And before that, much after that, sorry, 17, there was this, I give you the reference, anyway, A/7 /71/321. Anyway, it's the General Assembly resolution of 8th September. The publication date is 21 September, which resolves to give enhanced participation to indigenous peoples at the UN. And this was supplemented with a report by the Secretary General in a report dated 27th July 2020. And here, the whole issue is how are indigenous peoples going to participate? So, and indigenous peoples demanded participation at the highest possible levels to which is General Assembly, Human Rights Council, Economic and Social Council, and many other bodies of the United Nations, where at least with observer status. So ELSA actually is much more familiar with this, but I will just briefly say this, that the General Assembly, then it was Ban Ki-moon, I think, gave a report, and it was pretty, I think, generous. And we had some pretty good leadership from indigenous peoples, including the Mexico government and a few of the Scandinavian governments, which gave very good support. So one thing was clear, the documents, both the Secretary Generals and other documents said, it will not be at any level lower than ECOSOC accredited NGO. Now, you know, ECOSOC accredited NGOs, there are some indigenous peoples organizations as well, can participate in these meetings of the Economic and Social Council and its subsidiary bodies, and the Human Rights Council and its subsidiary bodies, and they can send documents of a certain length whenever there is a meeting going on. So as far as I know, it has still not been resolved exactly how indigenous peoples are going to be participate in UN meetings, apart from the existing setting of the Permanent Forum and EMRIT. But it is extremely crucial that we are able to participate at the higher tables, at decision-making levels. And I think climate change is actually providing a very good avenue for us to demonstrate the wisdom and knowledge that we have in regards to sustainable use of natural resources and forest conservation and conservation of other fragile or rich ecoscapes, including oceans, seas, tundra, desert, arid zones, etc. So this is one area we need progress, and I'm just at ELSA's request, I'm mentioning it, that we need to push this agenda in the UN. We need to push our leaders at Permanent Forum and at EMRIP, along with the Special Rapporteur, and at other forums, that we should not let this go, that the UN needs to decide on a system which gives us representation in the United Nations with dignity, as we as separate nations and peoples. I will stop there, and we'll go back to the session, and for, I think we have very little time. If there may be any questions and comments, please.
Thank you, Chief. Yes, we have about 10 minutes left, so we can take one or two comments or questions from the ladies. So please, if you have a question or a comment, you can put your hand up. Oh, Professor Elsa, I see your hand.
I wanted to thank very sincerely Chief Devashish Roy for his presentation and for weaving through self-determination with the other two pillars, fundamental pillars of the declaration, you know, land rights and cultural rights. And the way you brought us, you helped us travel, you know, through the concepts and how they're really woven with each other. You cannot disconnect them. They are so connected. And I just wanted to make a comment and ask you what you think about this. It is so important for Indigenous peoples to have quality participation at the United Nations. And they have stressed this since the beginning of the internationalization, like the 70s. And I wanted to ask you whether you think that this participation of Indigenous peoples at the international level is one expression of external self-determination of Indigenous peoples. This is one question I have. And the second question is whether you think it is not just symbolically important, but whether it helps in the very complex situations at home in terms of the expression of self-determination, which you told us before in response to the question of a sister. So that international expression of self-determination, does it help Indigenous peoples, you know, preserve or strengthen the right to self-determination at home? How do you think about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elsa, for your kind words and support, and also your very insightful thoughts about how Indigenous people's participation at United Nations meetings, firstly, whether is that an external level of participation, and then how this has helped Indigenous peoples in our struggles at home or not. But firstly, yes. In fact, my slide should have included that. In my other slide, I have it, that permanent forum, expert mechanism, and all these are also the avenues where we are acting in an international context of taking our nations and people's agenda. In fact, sometimes governments get very nervous, and we were once almost summoned by Parliament for speaking at the United Nations, similarly to just across the border in Tripura state, had problems with the government, and I don't know who else. And we were under huge surveillance in New York too, even 3 years ago, but never mind. But I think one of the things is that it makes us do our homework to able to talk about our own people to an audience which is not familiar with us. So that itself is a big exercise for us to make us think too, particularly in comparison to other people's self-determination and other Indigenous people's economic, social, civil, political, cultural, etc. rights. And then also, what has been very crucial, one of them is you must frame it in the language of rights. It's not just politics. At home, you go to a demonstration, or you give a fiery speech, or do a hunger strike, or do a memorandum to a minister. But this is your political right. But here in the United Nations, you have to link it to international human rights instruments. So it's the language of rights. And that, I think, is a training for political actors too, where when you come home too, when you meet your minister, your MP, your prime minister, or other things that you learn. And the other important thing is that I think learning from one another, not just learning. I remember when there were violations of human rights in amongst one nation or people, they just took out a piece of paper, wrote out a protest letter, and just took the document across the room in Geneva or New York, etc. And people signed up. This letter to the prime minister of this and that country. And so one of the things what we learn from each other, how do we compel our government to agree to our right, or do this against this private company or this bank? And we learn from each other. We did solidarity with one another's struggles. We sometimes applied many of these things that we learned from other peoples at home, and different peoples have different strengths, and we have applied many of this, and then we have developed alliances on a institutional organizational level. So this is where you are, Elsa, and now you are in the from secretariat. Now you're not there. You're in Columbia University. Mirna was member and chairperson. She's in FIMI. Myself, I'm here in Chittagong Tracks, and we're meeting up with friends. Next week, we go to Bali, along with Joan Carling and many other friends I was in. So, and these friendships sustain. And also the links between FIMI has indigenous women's groups in Bangladesh and in nearby countries which are working on indigenous rights. And I meet them at the local level in my hometown sometimes, which are FIMI's people in the Chittagong tracks. So I think that I am optimist in the sense that it's not in vain. I mean, I always, as a human rights defender, say, just because such and such rape of a woman, the rapist was not arrested or prosecuted and convicted, doesn't mean that my struggle against rape was not successful. Because can someone tell me with statistics that so many more rapes and sexual assault would not have happened if we did not protest against that one rape? It was in the press, it was in the media. At least it was with the police we are dealing that we are going to get that rapist. So I think with human rights and indigenous people's rights too, and many of them are human rights, just not civil, but yeah, I mean, they are individual human rights, many of them are collective human rights. And I think here too, sometimes it is difficult for us to demonstrate the gains that we have made in a quantitative manner by ticking off a box. But the losses would have sustained, the hurt, the other negative things that would have happened to us if we did not engage is something which is definitely would have happened. We cannot count with a number and figure and say so many bad things would have happened at so many times. So I think it's my deep faith that our interactions at indigenous forums, at UN particularly, but also other forums, we are working outside at international. And also, I am much more local than international now. I spend much more time home. So working, I walked for 7 days, went to the remotest village in my territory. Also, women carbares we appointed, schools, drinking water. But the most interesting thing was that I understood the frontier communities, and we met people who sighted Bengal tiger 2 years ago, wild bison, and then on the rivers I could see some sustainable shifting cultivation. which did not cut too many trees or burn too many trees, but they had the rice harvest. Learned about challenges of rats, famine, rats eating up bamboo fruit and flower and multiplying and devouring. Anyway, but the fact is that, so that keeps me going, this local stuff. But anyway, again, to answer, Elsa, I think indigenous peoples have benefited so much from these interactions. Very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Elsa, and thank you, Chief, for this session that has been very informative for me, and I know for the sisters as well. We've come to the end of our time right now because we have to also let go of our interpreters, but we thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to having you again in our session that's coming up in a few weeks. So sisters, we will have Chief back with us in a few weeks in April for another session. And so anything that has come up now at the end of the session can, I'm sure he can respond to in our next class. And so thank you so much, Chief. We're grateful to have you here with us to share your knowledge and experience with us, and also responding to the questions that the sisters have had, and making it very contextual, especially for the sisters in Asia. So thank you.
Thank you.
And we
Thank you
look
very
forward
much.
to seeing you next
Also,
time.
thank you to Lucia, Maria, Pema, who have written on that. Thank you very much. Look forward.
Thank you so much. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Take care, all of you. Too.
All right. Thank you, sisters, and we look forward to seeing you on Monday again for our next session. Please, again, we remind you to constantly keep looking at your calendars so that you know that you're reminded of the time that we're meeting. So please take care. Have a good a good day for those who are just starting their day. Have a good evening for those who are in the evening, and have a great weekend, and see you again on Monday. Bye, everyone, and take care.
Thank you.